Verse 7, they passed to the lee of Crete. Verse 16, passed to the lee of Cauda. And so it means that they are going to the south side of the islands to seek shelter from the northern winds. This is real stuff happening there in real time. Verse 14 describes how they faced a northeaster. Do you know what a northeaster is? A northeaster is a man, it's just got hurricane force winds coming with it. It is a storm that is just massive. It's coming through quickly. It's hitting hard. It's a northeaster. It's racing across the Mediterranean. And so they're trying to help you see all that Paul and these folks are going to go through. Verse 16 describes, little details, how they struggled to get the lifeboat secure, that little dinghy. Verse 17 describes how they passed ropes under the ship to undergird the ship. So they would have tightened the cables around the hull with a winch, hoping that the boat wouldn't come apart during the rough weather. So even if you don't know these stories through Acts, if you're new to the Bible, maybe even first time here at church today, you can tell by the details I'm already pointing out that Paul and his shipmates are about to go through a storm. And then the spoiler alert, of course, is that they are going to get shipwrecked too. But here's the question that needs to be asked. Will the storm and the shipwreck stop Paul from getting to Rome? What do you think? I mean, we've been talking about Paul for a long time, many, many months now, as we've traveled through the book of Acts. And here are some of the words that we've come up with time and again. Unafraid, undeterred. And when we get to the very last word in the Greek, in the book of Acts, chapter 28, verse 31, we're going to run into this word unhindered. And so here's a truth about Paul in relation to that question that I asked. Will the storm, will the shipwreck stop him from getting to Rome? Well, here's the truth. Paul was undeterred by the storm and the shipwreck, right? I mean, we know that he's unafraid, which we're going to point out in just a second again, but he is undeterred. Nothing is going to stop the Jesus movement. Have you learned this theme yet? Through 8 chapters, this is the theme. Nothing's going to stop the Jesus movement, the gospel. So let's get into some of the characters. First, there's a character named Julius. We're going to look at his kindness in verse 1 and verse 3 and in some other places in the chapter. But before we talk about him, I want to look at verse 2 for just a second, because there's a guy mentioned there named Aristarchus. Again, we're getting into the details. These are real people functioning in real time. Aristarchus, we've heard of him before, if you remember. We heard about him in chapter 19. He was one of Paul's traveling companions that were mentioned when the riot broke out in Ephesus. Remember the riot breaking out? All right, he was mentioned there. Chapter 20, he's a traveling companion with Paul when he went from Corinth to Jerusalem. And he is going to end up in prison with Paul in Rome. And that's according to Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. So guys like Aristarchus and Julius are some of the hidden figures of the Bible. And this fall, I'm going to be preaching a series on the hero figures of the Bible and the hidden figures of the Bible as well. So I'm going to cover the heroes like the Pauls of the Bible, but we're also going to look at some of the Christians serving in the shadows. People like the Aristarchuses and the Gaiuses, you remember that name, and the Juliuses that are mentioned in the Bible. In fact, I think I have a little graphic to show you. You're going to see this graphic time and again as we talk about the heroes and the hidden figures of the faith. So let's look at one of the characters, Julius. Julius was known for his kindness. Gosh, just this morning in our prayer time, we happened to read Galatians 5, 22 and 23, the fruit of the Spirit. And one of the fruit of the Spirit is what? Kindness, right? And so here's a man who exhibits kindness in his life. I have to ask you, is this an attribute in your life? Are you known for your kindness to others? Julius was known for his kindness. And as you look at verse 3, you can see it. You can see it in action. And really, it's pretty remarkable. It says, Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him. Remember who him is. Him is Paul, the prisoner. He didn't have to do any of this stuff for a prisoner, but in his kindness and in his compassion, he was good to Paul. He allowed him to go to his friends, it says in verse 3, so they might provide for his needs. Now, who was Julius? Do you know much about Julius in the Bible? I mean, I only know about a few Juliuses out there. I know Julius Caesar. I know Julius Randle. I'm a UK fan, so I know who that is. Julius Erving. He was one of my favorite basketball players. Dr. J. I also know of the Orange Julius drink at Dairy Queen. That is my favorite Julius of all. But this guy is none of them, and he probably would have liked that drink as well, just like I like it. But Julius, no, the Bible tells us that he was a centurion. If you look at verse 1, he was a centurion who belonged to the imperial regiment, which means that he was a man of valor, a man of courage, a man of experience. He was a man who was a leader of a cohort of soldiers. He was gracious. He was kind to Paul. And in verse 3, we see the first way that he was kind to Paul. It says there that he let him connect with friends so his needs could be met. Connect is that fill in. He let him connect with friends so his needs could be met. Secondly, he did something extraordinary as well. He let Paul, the prisoner, voice his opinion about the ship's voyage. We see it in verse 10. We see it in verse 31. Now, that doesn't mean that he took Paul's advice. We're going to see him take advice and not take advice. Here, it doesn't mean that he took his advice, but at least he gave the prisoner a voice, which is pretty remarkable stuff. So take, for example, what happened in the first 12 verses. In verse 4, if you glance down there, it says, they set sail for Rome, they followed the coastline, and then they tried to move past that big island of Crete. Remember that from the picture? You saw it on the map. It was that big island right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. I want to show you a picture of Crete. We were there not too long ago, and we happened to be on the north side of Crete. I had a bunch of different pictures like this, but I wanted to show this one because it has an older boat, a newer boat, a castle. It's got the whole thing all in one picture. But that is our trip to the north side of Greece, to the harbor there. Beautiful again, just like all the other places. But here in the text, they would have been on the south side. Now, I want you to look at the trouble they had sailing. So follow along with me if you look at verse 7. Slow headway, it says. It also says the wind didn't allow us to hold our course. Verse 8, moved along the coast with difficulty. And then we found out why they had real trouble in verse 9. More detail. It says, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was what? What's the next word? After. It was after the Day of Atonement. Now, why is that important? Because that day, the Day of Atonement, was often in September or October each year. And sailors said that it was best to sail between May and early September. So here's the problem mentioned here with the word after. It is after the time when they really should be out and about. After September 15th, it was risky. If they would have waited like mid-November, a little bit longer, a couple months later, it would have been suicidal. It is so rough. And so now here they are in the risky zone. Now, I don't know much about sailing. That was my first cruise when I went to these islands, and I think I was very content that the seas were calm, right? There was one night where we were sitting at a show about 10 o'clock at night. The whole boat started doing that. And that was all I wanted right there. That was all I wanted. But these guys are going, all right, we're going to do it. It's risky, but we're all for it. If you look at verse 10, Paul is warning them that it's too risky, and you got a big verse, but I just want you to see this little line at the beginning. Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be what? Disastrous. I mean, if we go after this Day of Atonement, it's going to be disastrous. And he gives some descriptions. There's going to be great loss to ship and cargo and to our lives also. What are we doing here, guys? You know, that kind of talk going on. And in verse 11, the centurion decides to get a second opinion. He asked the pilot, he asked the ship owner, they said go. Verse 12, the majority voted to go. And so why in the world would they take a chance? That's kind of nuts, right? I mean, it's risky, but I think I would have stayed put. Well, it all comes down to what? Money, money, money. Because here they are, they got an Alexandrian ship. It's carrying expensive grain. And the sooner they got to their destination, the sooner they got what? Paid, right? So they chose reward over risk. Now, was it a good decision? No. If you know what's coming in the story, and I've already given it away with the spoiler alert, you know what's coming. There's going to be a shipwreck. This is not the best of ideas. But as they face the storm and as they survive the shipwreck, here's something we see in the story. We see the courage of Paul during a crisis. I mean, we've already seen kindness in Julius's life, reminding us to have that fruit of the Spirit in our life. But like Paul, we need to have courage in our life as we go through crises. Warren Wiersbe writes in his commentary that the major purpose that Luke had in mind was the presenting of Paul as the courageous leader who could take command of a difficult situation in a time of crisis. So think about his ministry. I used a lot of C words in past sermons. We talked about his conversion, the Damascus story, Acts 9, 22, 26, his conversion, and then we talked about his call. Well, as you continue through his story, it's not just conversion and call, but there's also a lot of conflict, the third C. The fourth C is seen here. There's a lot of crisis in his life as well. So there is conversion, call, conflict, crisis. I mean, have you ever made this statement? I don't know how much more of this I can take. Anybody ever said that in your life? I don't know how much more of this I can take. I've been through this conflict and that crisis. I don't know how much more of this I can take. I give up. Lord, help me. I give up. I can't deal with this situation, my job situation, my health situation. Lord, I don't know how much more of this I can take. And you can imagine that Paul probably mumbled that a few times along the way. I mean, think about all the stuff: opposed, abused, imprisoned, storm, shipwreck. I mean, as you read chapter after chapter, it doesn't ever seem to end with this guy, right? He could have said that as well. I don't know how much more of this I can take. And yet, here's the truth. Paul is not only undeterred, but he is unafraid of another complicated crisis in his life. Now, I say complicated because in this instance, he doesn't have a lot of control over a lot of things. He's a prisoner, right? He's a prisoner, and he's offering advice that could spare them harm and heartache. And he even reveals, look at verse 24. He even reveals how an angel spoke to him, giving him a vision of what was to come. Did y'all see that? I want you to follow me. There's a lot of verses here today. Now, the problem is when people go through a crisis, meaning when you go through a crisis, when I go through a crisis, many times we tend to put our eyes on the problem, on the crisis, right? Here's what Paul did. Paul was someone who was looking to the problem solver. Big difference. But when we go through stuff and we make statements like, I don't know how much more I can take of this, we just look at the problem, and yet Paul, he could have done that. But instead he said, I'm going to look at the problem solver, because he is the one who has the power to protect me and to help me and to encourage me in what I'm facing. So when you go through a crisis, does your giant fill your field of vision? Does it fill your field of vision? Or are you looking to God for answers? You know, it's the same principle from the David and Goliath showdown. You remember how David saw God at work? And what did all of David's companions do? They looked at Goliath. And they saw him as large and in charge, and they were so caught up in the fact that he was, what was he, like 9 feet, something, 10 inches or something, and he had all that stuff, and he was strong, muscles. I mean, he had, like me, I mean, he, just, it was amazing. But they were focused on that, right? When really, who is large and in charge? Sovereign God is large and in charge, but sometimes we look at Goliath instead of looking at God. See, Paul had his eye on God. He had his eye on the mission that God gave him. The storm and the shipwreck for him were just distractions along the way that he discarded to keep moving along. So watch what happens in chapter 27. As you look at verses 13 through 20, look at that. The storm was not waning. It was not waning. And I think as you look at verse 14, remember that word northeaster, what it is? Hurricane force winds. I think that qualifies to support the statement that I've made that the storm was not waning. It was ramping up, and they wrapped the boat with ropes, hoping it wouldn't break apart. The storm raged for days. They threw cargo overboard. They threw tackle overboard. And look what it says in verse 20. We finally gave up all hope of being saved. So it's a good thing that they had this man in their boat who knew something about hope. In fact, he knew the one who could give him and them the hope they needed in the midst of the crisis. He's the one who can give us hope in the midst of our crisis. So the storm was not waning. The second thing is this: Paul was giving a word of encouragement. Notice that word courage right in the word encouragement there in verses 21 to 26. And he was giving a warning in verses 27 to 44. So the man of courage was trying to instill courage in them. That is what the word encouragement really is all about. In fact, I was at a fundraiser dinner the other night for Operation Cares Ministry, and the guy that was speaking, he explained that word well. He said that's what it is. When you are encouraging someone, you are instilling courage in them so they can go forward, so they can deal with the crisis that's going on in their life. It was an awesome explanation, right on, and that's what's going on here. So look at verse 21, if you would. It says, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, I love this part. He says, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. It's like, I told you so. Right? You shouldn't have done that. Why did you do that? Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So here comes the encouragement. Keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God. So here's a guy who not only is courageous, but he's faithful, right? He's faithful. I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must turn aground on some island. And that's what happened. That's what happened. 2 weeks into their journey, they took soundings, the Bible tells us, and they knew they were close to land. So the sailors, for being honest here, they're afraid. They're afraid at this point what happened. They're afraid they're going to be dashed against the rocks. So they actually lower the lifeboat to escape. And here comes Paul. He's got some advice. They better listen. he says in verse 31, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. And this time, the centurion took the advice. The sailors took his advice. And then he urged them to eat because he was confident they would survive. And you see that in verse 34. Well, the story tells us that all of them made it ashore. It also tells us how many people were on that boat. Again, the details showing this is real stuff happening in Paul's life, and that we have a God who helps us as we go through real stuff in life. There were 276 souls on board. That's how we say it with airplanes, right? I don't know how they say it with boats, but we'll say the same thing. 276 on there. And so some swam, some floated in on a plank, some, on a piece of the ship. They weren't, as gifted as those Olympic swimmers that won all those medals, for the United States. But they all made it. And they found out, as you get into chapter 28, verse 1, they all found out that they were on the island of Malta. Remember, it was that little island just south of Italy, south of Rome. And think about this truth. I didn't put this in the notes, but I thought about this later, that even when our lives seem shipwrecked, has your life ever felt like it was shipwrecked? Even when we feel that way, God has a way of placing us right where we need to be. That's what happened here. That storm could have taken them any direction, but they wound up right where they needed to be. And by the way, you're right where you need to be today, because you're in the Word of God and you're worshiping God and you're singing praise to God. You're right where you need to be today. And in fact, this sermon, there might be something in this text that God is going to say to you that will help you in your life. You are right where you need to be. They were right where they needed to be. And as you get into chapter 28, the first 10 verses, again, we see kindness. It says the unusual kindness of the Maltese people. That word unusual means extraordinary. So they weren't just kind, just kind people smiling at you. No, they were kind. It was deep in their heart. There's great compassion. They showed it in their lives as well. Just awesome. The Maltese people were unusually kind. Now, it was said about them that they were an uncivilized people. But I tell you what, they may have been uncivilized, but they got this part right, because they showed unusual kindness to Paul. It was raining and cold when they landed on the island, and the people welcomed them with a warm fire. Man, that's great. That was a nice gesture on their part. And here's Paul, as you look at verse 3, glance at 28:3. Here's Paul. He's always helping out, right? And so he's helping out. He was a tent maker. He wasn't lazy. He knew how to get things done. So here he was putting some brushwood on the fire. And what happens? A snake slithers out. Oh, man. Any of you just deathly afraid of snakes? My dad years ago, he's a pastor, many of you know, on a Sunday night service. Remember Sunday night service? We put a rubber snake in the pulpit. Do you think I got grounded the next day? Deathly afraid of snakes. Maybe you are as well. But here's Paul, and they start this fire. It's cool out, so the snake is probably in a bit of a stupor, and the warmth gets going. The snake comes out and bites him right in the hand, latches on, hanging on for dear life. And all these islanders are uncivilized, probably meaning they're a bit uneducated, maybe lack some understanding of things, that they thought that he would swell up and die. But I want you to notice something about God here. God, the God who protected him in the storm, protected him from the snake bite. See, we have a God of protection in our lives. The God who protected him in the storm protected him from the snake bite. Well, the story continues, and not only did the people in general welcome Paul, but the chief official, the leading man of the island, a guy named Publius, also welcomed Paul to his home. And while he was there, he healed Publius's father. His father had a fever. And there was a disorder in that day called a Malta fever that was caused by a microbe in goat's milk. So many people who look at this story think that's probably what he was going through at the time. He had the Malta fever, but he was healed. So what do you think happened when word got out that the guy with Malta fever, that was a problem for many people, got healed by this guy that shows up on the beach? What do you think happened? Everybody shows up at the door, right? We want to be healed of our problems. And so they do. They line up at the door. And the Bible says they were all healed. And so we learned this about God, the God whose power